Now, we saw this a little bit with Final Fantasy 16, and we've seen this steady decline for the Final Fantasy franchise for a while now. But I think now that with Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth coming out with its debut sales in Japan, this is definitive proof that Square Enix absolutely needs to adjust their strategy and their focus for Final Fantasy, because the series, as big as it's been in the past, selling millions of copies in its debut weeks before, it's been relegated down to under 300,000 units, which would be the lowest debut of a mainline Final Fantasy game that we've seen of all time in the modern era. And absolutely something needs to change here. So we're going to get into that and what's happening when it comes to what they can do with the next Nintendo Switch platform or portable gaming and Japan, because this is looking a bit bleak, but I do think that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll break down all the numbers here in the classic fashion. But before we do, what's good everyone? OJ here. Welcome back to another video. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, and click that notification bell to get my videos first. Now let's go ahead and jump right into the discussion here and the definitive proof, at least in my opinion, that Square Enix absolutely needs to change their strategy for Final Fantasy. They don't need to uproot what they're doing. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have made the games Sony exclusive or PlayStation 5 console exclusive, because they've been able to develop great games when it comes to Final Fantasy 7 Remake, originally on PS4, then PC, PS5, and FF16 on PS5, coming to PC later, and FF7 Rebirth, which is an incredible game. I love the game myself. It's a Game of the Year contender, and it might be my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time, or definitely up there in the top 3 as I blitz past the 20-hour mark and continue to just really have a ton of fun. So this is not a knock on the game itself. I think the game is fantastic. I'm simply talking about the viability of the franchise, the popularity of it, its status as a massive system seller and mover in this industry, and what it's been reduced to, at least with the Japanese sales here. So shout outs to Gamatsu for the beat with this one, then we're going to get into what happened. So the Famitsu sales for February 26, 2024 through March 3rd, 2024. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth for the PlayStation 5 was the highest selling new release, opening up at 262,656 units. Now, just for some comparison's sake here, Final Fantasy 16 for the PS5 last year opened up at 336,027 units, which I was very critical of because it was a big drop from what we saw with Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 7 Remake. And now we have even another drop here from Final Fantasy 16 to Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, and that was back in June 2023. Now, the original Final Fantasy 7 Remake for the PlayStation 4 opened up at 702,853 copies sold back in April of 2020, but you also have to realize that the PlayStation 4 had about a 4 million lead, a little bit less than that lead when it comes to the install base. 9.1 million PS4s in Japan compared to 5.3 million PlayStations. But I think that the bigger thing there is that not necessarily the install base, but it's the software sales rate. PS4 software sold considerably better than PS5 software. If you just compare it, people at that point were buying more PlayStation 4 software, or just people in general. There was more of a point towards PlayStation, at least at that point, than there is now, where it's completely shifted towards the Nintendo Switch. So you also have to factor that in, at least when it comes to physical sales. But I think the bigger thing here that people aren't really talking about or paying attention to, and pretty much the main point of my video in terms of how Square Enix has to completely change what they're doing and their strategy, because they're losing out on millions upon millions of dollars, is this point right here. The fact that the Nintendo Switch sold 62,531 units this week, and the PS5 sold 48,067 units. So what that means is that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, a major, big Final Fantasy title, had almost no impact on hardware when it comes to people going out there buying the system for the game. Now, throughout the history of Final Fantasy, it's always been a console seller. It's always been a console mover. But one thing that I've noticed with the past couple Final Fantasies is that not only are they selling way less than what they did before, but they no longer drive console sales like they used to. We used to see sales upwards of 300,000 units when a Final Fantasy game launches, even sometimes higher than that at the height of the popularity of Final Fantasy in the PS1 and PS2 era. When it comes to console Final Fantasy, obviously we're not discussing Final Fantasy 14 or like the MMO stuff or like the side quest stuff, but when it comes to the main Final Fantasy games, you would see systems moving off the shelves for Final Fantasy in Japan, and you're not seeing that here. I also want to make another thing. This is just Japanese sales and it doesn't include digital, so we're not talking about the US and all that, which we could see bigger sales there. I know that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is one of the best sellers on Amazon, so I do think that the game is doing okay, but we did get reports that there was a 30% drop in the physical sales in the UK, but we still need to wait on the digital sales ratio there, where UK it's going way more towards digital. I also want to note here, guys, people have talked about digital for Japan. Digital for Japan isn't as big of a driver as it is in other places. People still buy a lot of physical games, so even if Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had some decent digital sales, it's still a huge drop off from where Final Fantasy VII Remake was, which that sold over 700,000 units, not including digital, and of course even a drop off from Final Fantasy 16, which was already on the lower end for a Final Fantasy game. So to me, the biggest thing here and the biggest problem is the fact that Final Fantasy is no longer a system seller in Japan, and the fact that it sold less than 270,000 units. I've never seen a modern end Final Fantasy ever since I've been covering it, since I think 2010. I've been covering Final Fantasy, been covering everything, at least on YouTube channels here. You'll always see the game sell 500,000 units or something high like that, but it's the most recent games where we're seeing to where it's just dipped dramatically. Now, I am going to put up a post for you guys here. This is showing off the Final Fantasy franchise sales when it comes to the debut sales in Japan. Just Japan, Final Fantasy debut sales dating all the way back to Final Fantasy VII on the PS1. And as you can see, there is a dramatic dip here. But if you look at 7 games, Final Fantasy 7, 8, 9, 10, 10-2, 12 and 13, all of those sold minimum 1.4 million in its debut week sales, at least minimum 1.4 million in Japan. And all of those games helped drive hundreds of thousands of units for people going out there and picking up the system. Even with Final Fantasy 15, which wasn't as successful as the previous Final Fantasy games that I talked about, even that was a bigger driver for system sales when it comes to Final Fantasy 15 coming out. So it's very, very concerning here. When you look overall at the sales numbers and you look at the comparison, you can kind of see where the decline started, and it was absolutely Final Fantasy 13-2, which maybe could be expected because it's a sequel to one of the Final Fantasy games, and you're expecting a dip when you have a sequel, and then Lightning Return sold even less than that. But then you had Final Fantasy 15, which went up to 716,000, and Final Fantasy 7 Remake right there at 700,000. And if you factor in digital, hey, that's pretty close to 1 million, right? Maybe it's somewhat close, but then bam, Final Fantasy 16, obviously the install base, things were a little bit rough there. Final Fantasy has been in all different situations, all different scenarios when it comes to Final Fantasy, whether it's launching at the beginning of the life and it has a smaller install base, or the middle of the life, or the end of the life, but it's always been able to. When you saw Final Fantasy 7 through 13, it was always able to get crazy amounts of sales and push people to go out there and buy the hardware, and that's just not the case here. Now, what is the solution? What are they going to do? And why does this definitively prove what I'm trying to say here with them with a portable or high-end Final Fantasy that's separate? Well, I think this is the reason why. If you look at companies like Capcom, for example, they had a plan heading into the generation. They had Monster Hunter World, which they were doing, and then they also had Monster Hunter Rise, which that was a high-end portable version or lower-end version for the Nintendo Switch, which they did later port over to Xbox and PlayStation. They sold 10 million copies plus of that. They even had a separate AA style of game with Monster Hunter Stories, which sold over 1 million units on the Nintendo Switch itself as well. So as you can see there, for their biggest franchise, they had something set. Now, Square Enix was almost half set with this, right? They had Nier Automata, which they scrambled to put that game together and get a port studio to make that. They had Dragon Quest that they built specifically for the Nintendo Switch with Dragon Quest 11, but they did not have a plan for Final Fantasy outside of the older games and some remasters like Crisis Core. And I think that ultimately ended up costing them when it comes to the current systems and sales and revenue there. We're still seeing how Capcom benefited from that with Monster Hunter Rise and having that on the Nintendo Switch with those massive sales. Square Enix needs to kind of go back to the drawing board. Now, they can still take their deals with Sony. I don't think this is all about just being on the PlayStation 5, because if you look at Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 8, Final Fantasy 9, 10, all of those were just on the PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2. Final Fantasy 10-2, Final Fantasy 12, those were all exclusives as well, and those sold big, millions of units, some of them over 2.5 million with Final Fantasy 8. So I don't think it was necessarily just it being exclusive, and that's the reason why. It's because of the style of game. It's because of what fans are looking for. And yes, you can talk about competition from other things, but I also think that there are a large number of people that feel that Square Enix is not giving them what they want with Final Fantasy. Now, with Final Fantasy 7 Rebirth, I loved it. I think that it's really cool and it's very good, but there is a base of people who want a high-end turn-based Final Fantasy game. There are people who want that traditional or classic experience. There are people who feel that Square Enix has not delivered that in a new sense, and the Switch would have been a perfect opportunity, just like we saw with Monster Hunter Rise, just like we saw with Shin Megami Tensei 5, to deliver on that and have millions of people buy that game. I think that with Dragon Quest XI, we saw that as well, built specifically in Unreal Engine 4 for the Nintendo Switch, not a port of the PS4 or Nintendo 3DS version, but built for the system. That did incredibly well in Japan too. So to me, they didn't have a plan when it comes to Final Fantasy and Nintendo Switch. And I think that it kind of backfired that they didn't, because they could have done something separate and have their big Final Fantasies with PlayStation, but then still have something else and make plenty of money there. So going forward in the future, you kind of have to look at the optics. And the optics right now and say, hey, look, if Sony's going to give you that money for development and a huge bag, sure, take it, do that. You want to push technology, you want to push graphics, you want to keep doing that with Final Fantasy, there's nothing wrong with that. But I would say that the smart thing to do would probably be to get another team together, have them look at the Nintendo Switch 2 and the hardware, whatever you want to do, build a game specifically built for that to where it plays, runs good on there, because it's going to do better in Japan. The portable gaming is just going to be that. Nintendo dominates Japan when it comes to the software sales and hardware sales at this point. Have something built specifically for that. And of course, if you want, you can port that over to other systems. So if there is a little bit of a flop with your biggest, newest Final Fantasy game, if it doesn't sell as much, you still have this other game over here that can put up some crazy numbers, just like Monster Hunter Rise did on the Nintendo Switch. Thankfully, Monster Hunter World also sold really good, better than Monster Hunter Rise, but just in case it didn't, and just so you can kind of cross all your T's and dot your I's and have everything covered for your main franchise, your biggest money maker, you have to take advantage of the markets that are there. And so far, Square Enix did not, with one of their biggest franchises, Final Fantasy, truly take advantage of a system that has 140 million units out there. Don't get me wrong, there are Final Fantasy games on the Nintendo Switch, but those are older ports of games. Those are stuff that's like remasters and all that. There's nothing unique built for it, when we saw multiple other developers like Capcom, like Atlus, actually build their biggest or best games for that platform. We saw Persona 5 and how well that did. So Square Enix, very unfortunate that they weren't able to get that done when it comes down to it, but I think that they will kind of adjust. I do feel that Sony's going to continue to try to see if they can get exclusivity when it comes to the next major Final Fantasy 17 or anything like that. So I don't think we'll see anything soon with the Nintendo Switch. Obviously, this system is on its way out, but with the Nintendo Switch 2, there needs to be a legitimate plan so you do not get caught once again. This system's selling like gangbusters in Japan. The games are doing incredibly well, and we have nothing new when it comes down to offer for our biggest franchise with Final Fantasy. There's just nothing, and we're just here doing this one thing, whereas companies like Capcom and Atlus are making a killing over there on the Nintendo Switch, offering their biggest games and building some stuff specifically built for the Nintendo Switch, at least with a game or two when it comes to their biggest franchises, whether that's Capcom with Monster Hunter, or that's Persona or SMT when it comes to Atlus. So what do you guys think about all of this when it comes down to what I had to say here? What do you think is the move for them? I think that, once again, I don't blame them for the course that they took. That made sense. When you were making Final Fantasy VII Remake and you were making Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and all of that, it made sense to partner up and do that and focus on what you need to do here. But now that you've seen what's happened, I think an adjustment. Once again, you don't have to stop making those high-end super graphics Final Fantasy, whatever the case is, PlayStation hardware, take their money, but that doesn't mean you can't create something separate as a high-end separate thing, just like Capcom did with Monster Hunter Rise. So what do you guys think about everything that I had to say here? What are your thoughts on the debut sales for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the lack of system moving potential and power that it had on there? I think that's the most shocking thing. All right, guys, that wraps it up for this video here. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please make sure you hit that like button, subscribe if you're someone new, click that notification bell, check out my other videos right here on screen, and we'll see you for the next one. Peace.